encourages her students to think about learning and to learn to do that excellently. I take it many of us have really big concerns about our educational system these days and how best to educate young people. Those are things we get to think about tonight. Is there some kind of pedagogy that might alleviate teacher burnout or keeps teachers in the classrooms for many years? What kind of pedagogy might help with that? And that's the kind of questions we're going to be thinking about tonight. Just as a word about the Grimes, this yearly lecture, it's named after the Reverend Donald Grimes, who from 1972 to 2005 was a teacher, a much beloved and respected teacher, a counselor and an administrator at King's College. And I think he'd be overjoyed to see what topics we're going to be talking about tonight. Myself, I'm Regan Lance Reitzman. I'm the chair of the philosophy department here at King's College, which is located way up in the northeastern northeastern corner of Pennsylvania. It's a Catholic liberal arts college in the Holy Cross tradition. In any case, I also direct I'm the co-director of the honors program, and I'd like to thank Bernard Prusak from the King's College's McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility for also putting in for some of the work and funds for tonight's talk. And for tonight's talk, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Jason Baehr. Dr. Jason Baehr is a philosophy professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He's an expert in virtue epistemology, and he's written several books, including The Inquiring Mind, which was published by Oxford in 2011, and the book Deep in Thought, which is going to be the subject of much of tonight's talk, which he published with Harvard Education Press in 2021. Its subtitle is A Practical Guide for Teaching for the Intellectual Virtues, the particular kind of pedagogy he's going to be talking about with us tonight. Jason has been here once at King's before to give the Grimes, and so you can infer from his presence at the Grimes in 2015 that we loved what he had to say and we're very impressed and happy to have him back 8 years later to talk to us again. Dr. Baehr has not only authored books and many articles and book chapters, he's also had a 3-year project funded by the John Templeton Foundation called the Intellectual Virtues and Education Project, out of which an edited volume arose. So wonderful to have Dr. Baehr with us tonight. The way things are going to work tonight is after Dr. Baehr talks for about 45 minutes, we're going to have a response from a wonderful speaker as himself, and that would be Kwado Oppong-Wadie, who has an EDD in education from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is presently a lecturer at Elmhurst University in Chicago and has 9 years of experience teaching at a middle school, I believe it's elementary and middle school in Chicago called the Village Leadership Academy that has a social justice pedagogy. So I think it's a wonderful mix to have Dr. Baehr speaking about intellectual virtues pedagogy and a respondent who has experience both as a college professor in an education program and as a practitioner in a social justice pedagogy program. So we're going to be turning in a moment to our speakers. I just want to mention a couple of things before we get going. We want to have your questions. As I mentioned, Dr. Baehr is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then Kwado, Dr. Oppong-Wadie will be speaking or responding, but there should be time for questions and answers after that. And so we will go for this event till about 8:15 Eastern Standard Time. And again, that should leave us some time for questions. If you have questions, please send them via the chat mechanism, and please send them to me. Again, my name's Regan Reitzman. I'll do my best to try to get your questions in. Now, if I notice any questions happen to come from students, I'm especially going to try to privilege those questions, but I'll do my best to get as many of your questions in. Again, send them to Regan Reitzman via the chat function. So with all of that said, let's turn our attention to Dr. Baehr, and welcome, Jason. We're happy to have you again.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. And if any of you were there at my talk roughly 10 years ago, what I say today may have significant overlap with what I said there. So my apologies. The topic is similar, though I have a little more experience under my belt today than I did a decade ago. Want to say thank you to Regan and to Professor Oppong-Wadie for being here, and the invitation from Professor Reitzman and the commentary from Professor Oppong-Wadie. So thank you. Thanks to those of you who've devoted some of your evening to coming out and listening. So grateful to be here. Looking forward to talking about these things with you and to the fruitful conversation that I'm sure will ensue. I will go ahead and share my screen, and we should be good to go. All right. Very good. So what I hope to talk with you tonight about has in kind of the background or at its heart the following question. The question is, what is the ultimate point or purpose of our work with students? And for those of you who are educators, I encourage you to just take a brief moment to step back and think about this question and just consider, aside from what might occupy us kind of day to day in our immediate concerns in teaching or the other work we do with students, what are we ultimately, finally, hoping to accomplish with our students? What kind of an impact are we hoping to have? And the answer that I'm going to propose to this question is alluded to nicely by John Dewey in his 1910 book, How We Think. Dewey says this: while it is not the business of education to prove every statement made, it is its business to cultivate deep-seated and effective habits of discriminating tested beliefs from mere assertions, guesses, and opinions. To develop a lively, sincere, and open-minded preference for conclusions that are properly grounded. No matter how much an individual knows as a matter of hearsay and information, if he has not attitudes and habits of this sort, he is not intellectually educated. Now, the term I'm going to use for these deep-seated and effective habits that Dewey refers to is intellectual virtues. And I hope to do two things in connection with this theme. One, I hope to provide an overview of what intellectual virtues are and how they're related to other more familiar cognitive and characterological strengths. I also want to provide at least a rough sketch of what it might look like to educate for intellectual virtues in a classroom setting. I'm going to try to devote more than half of my time to this second aim, which means I'm going to have to move fairly quickly through my overview of what intellectual virtues are. But I'll go ahead and jump in to addressing this question. What are intellectual virtues? And I think it's helpful to approach an answer to this question by starting with our more familiar ways of thinking about character or virtue. So I suspect that for most of us, when we use those terms or think about those terms, what comes to mind would be certain moral character attributes, or maybe certain civic virtues, qualities like kindness or responsibility, generosity, respect, caring, and so on. We might think of some of these moral characteristics or moral attributes of character as moral virtues, and of moral virtues as the character attributes of good neighbors. So moral virtues are the character attributes of good neighbors. And we can think of civic virtues as character attributes of good citizens. So these sorts of attributes and virtues, I take it, are familiar to many of us, and they're what often comes to mind when we think about character and virtue. But I think this conceptualization of character is importantly incomplete. Specifically, I think it fails to capture the fact that our character also has an epistemic, a robustly epistemic dimension, which is to say that our character expresses itself not just in our lives as neighbors or citizens, but also in our distinctively epistemic aims and activities. in our aims and activities as thinkers and learners. Who we are as people, the quality of our character, is reflected not just in how we treat our neighbors or behave as citizens, but also in how we think and how we learn. So to give you a quick opportunity to kind of reflect on and maybe identify some of the large-scale features of your own intellectual character, I'd invite you to reflect on and think about the following questions. Do I enjoy learning? Do I care about truth, accuracy, and understanding? Am I disposed to wonder and ask questions? Do I seek out alternative perspectives on important or controversial issues? How do I tend to respond to counter-evidence or intellectual disagreement? Do I have a keen sense of my intellectual limitations or cognitive fallibility? Am I able and willing to think differently from my peers? Do I speak up for what I believe in? How do I respond to experiences of intellectual struggle or failure? So my suggestion is that your answers to these questions say something both about who you are as a person, what you care about and value, and how you're disposed to act and think and feel, but they also say something about your identity as a thinker or as a learner. They say something, your answers to these questions say something about how you're disposed to reason, what you're disposed to pay attention to, what you care about when it comes to the activities of thinking and learning. So we can think then of intellectual virtues as the character attributes of good thinkers and learners, moral virtues as the character attributes of good neighbors, and civic virtues as the character attributes of good citizens. So here are a few examples of intellectual virtues, and it's probably going to be hard for some of you to read the text here, so I'll just quickly go through and name the virtues that are on the list. These come from the Intellectual Virtues Academy of Long Beach, a middle school that I, with other people, helped found about a decade ago, that is systematically designed around helping students make meaningful progress in intellectual virtues in the context of, not as a separate program for, but in the context of academic teaching and learning. So the first three virtues have to do with getting the learning process started and headed in the right direction. Unsurprisingly, curiosity tops the list. But you could be curious and say not really be reliable at working out your curiosity and thinking for yourself and persevering. So we also need virtues like autonomy, the ability to think for ourselves and make our own decisions. And that virtue at the same time needs to be balanced by a willingness to admit our limitations and mistakes and get the kind of assistance and help we need in the learning process from others, which is the role of intellectual humility. The next three virtues are aimed at kind of keeping the learning process on track and headed in the right direction. First of all, it's important for us to be attentive. And by that, I mean personally present in the learning process. I'm thinking here of something like mindfulness applied to thinking and learning. It's also important that we be careful in our thinking, that we be able to identify potential mistakes and avoid those mistakes when we need to. At the same time, someone can avoid mistakes, but not go very deep with what they're learning. We all have students who can regurgitate information on exams, for instance, but who aren't really good at explaining that material and connecting it with other ideas and demonstrating that they really understand what they're talking about. So thoroughness complements carefulness in this context. The last three virtues on the list are aimed at overcoming familiar obstacles to productive learning. One of those obstacles is a kind of narrow-mindedness, or a tendency to kind of think in terms of familiar perspectives and categories. And so to overcome that, we need open-mindedness. Similarly, progress in learning for ourselves and for our students is sometimes inhibited by fear and a reluctance to take risks. So we need courage in order to grow and learn intellectually. Finally, it can be tempting to want to give up when learning is difficult. So in that context or situation, we need the virtue of intellectual tenacity. So this is just a list of 9 virtues. It's fairly fine-grained. I hope it gives you a decent feel for kind of the substance of the character attributes of good thinkers and learners. I also want to situate intellectual virtues, not just with respect to familiar ideas about moral and civic character, but also with respect to other familiar cognitive or epistemic achievements or goods. And I'm thinking here of things like, for instance, knowledge, or a certain kind of natural aptitude in a given domain. We all know that a person can have a lot of knowledge and maybe be naturally very smart, but also be intellectually arrogant or lazy or closed-minded. So being smart in a broad sense, or being a good thinker, involves much more than just knowledge and natural ability. Similarly, someone can have a host of important intellectual skills, critical thinking skills, for instance, but be uninclined to use them, and so perhaps still be intellectually lazy, or be reckless in how they apply those skills, and therefore lack intellectual carefulness. So what intellectual virtues do is they fill out the personal dimension of what it is to be smart, or what it is to be a good thinker. They complement and add to skills, natural ability, knowledge, and other capacities and strengths required in that domain. So the conclusion then for this section would just be that intellectual virtues can be situated. My goal here is for you to know how to know where to locate intellectual virtues kind of in your own thinking. And the suggestion is that intellectual virtues are situated between moral and civic virtues. Like those virtues, they are dispositions to act, think, and feel, dispositions that say something important about us as persons. But then, like other familiar cognitive strengths and achievements, like knowledge and ability and skills, they're epistemically oriented. They have their basis in a concern with knowledge and truth and understanding and wisdom. So they fit between these other more familiar kinds of strengths. Okay, well, with that overview before us, I'm going to turn now to say a few things about what it might look like to teach in an intentional and conscious and deliberate way for intellectual virtues in a classroom setting. And I'm going to be taking material from a recent book of mine, which I'll say more about in just a minute. But that book, in turn, draws a lot on research and experience that predated my writing of the book. A lot of this is research that was produced at Harvard's Project Zero Research Institute at the graduate school, the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Work by Shari Tishman, David Perkins, Eileen Jay, and especially Ron Richard. So if you want to learn more about some of these ideas, I highly recommend the work that's been produced there. There are online resources that are very valuable that you can access as well. And then a lot of what I have to say has been informed by my experience with the Intellectual Virtues Academy in Long Beach, and with the many hours of conversation and observation and engagement with the teachers and the leadership and the students there over the last 10 years. Okay, so first of all, a couple of preliminary points about this idea of teaching for intellectual virtues. As I think about it, it's not a single intervention or practice or approach. As you'd imagine, teaching for good intellectual character, it necessarily is complex because the kind of change or growth that it seeks is complex. So I like to think of teaching for intellectual virtues as involving a combination of principles, postures, and practices. And by principles, I mean general considerations about teaching and learning that it's important for us to keep in mind and to internalize as we seek to teach for intellectual virtues. And by postures, I mean attitudes or mindsets that we can adopt toward ourselves and our students at will. And then practices are self-explanatory, and I'll give you some examples in just a minute. So what I'm going to do, if you, my book Deep in Thought goes into depth about several principles, several postures, and then several practices. In the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about 3 principles and 2 practices. So first of all, I think it's important that we approach teaching for intellectual virtues with a kind of realistic sensibility, and that we set realistic goals and expectations for ourselves and our students. Intellectual virtues, as I'm sure you've already gathered, are a kind of epistemic or intellectual or educational ideal. And as with any form of idealism, if we think too naively or don't think carefully about what kind of progress or growth is possible relative to those goals, we can be setting ourselves up or setting our students up for disappointment. So I think it's important to think in sober and realistic terms about what we are hoping to accomplish when we set out to help our students make meaningful progress in intellectual virtues. And in fact, I think the question we should ask is simply, how might I be able to help my students make meaningful progress? And you'll have to define what counts as meaningful progress for you, but it would involve some kind of progress toward or approximation of the kinds of ideals that I've just described. So how can I help my students make meaningful progress, not in all the intellectual virtues, but in a limited subset of those virtues? I think that's a good place to start. A second principle that I think it's crucial for us to keep in mind is that intellectual character formation is a deeply personal and impersonal phenomenon and process. So in helping my students, or seeking to help my students become more curious or intellectually autonomous or humble or open-minded, I'm seeking to have some kind of impact on some of their fundamental educational beliefs and attitudes and feelings and behaviors. Those are deep changes. They aren't a matter of simply conveying information to our students. And both research and common sense suggests that students are not going to be open to that kind of fundamental, broadly ethical reorientation and internal reconfiguration if they aren't in an environment that they sense is safe and respectful and caring, if they don't feel known. And so because teaching for intellectual virtues seeks to affect personal change in students, and because that personal change is likely to happen only in certain kinds of environments marked by care and support and mutual respect and trust, it's also critical for us to ask from the get-go whether or the extent or to which or ways in which we're creating a safe and supportive classroom environment or culture. So I think that's pivotal. You could also think of this principle as trying to get at some of the, again, broadly ethical or social and emotional preconditions for educating for intellectual virtues. So also an important consideration for us to keep in mind and to be guided by in our pedagogical efforts and practices. Third, I think it's very important for us to keep in mind who our students are, what their various identities are. And here we could think about their cultural identity, or their racial or socioeconomic or developmental identity. Not all students are the same. And so what it looks like to educate for one group of students at one school or in one classroom might look different in various ways from what it looks like, well, from what it might look like if you were teaching a different group of students. So it's important to keep these various identities in mind and to allow them to inform which virtues we decide to focus on, how we conceptualize those virtues within limits, but how we conceptualize those virtues, and what our expectations are for our students when it comes to their abilities to practice and experience growth in these qualities. So for instance, if I'm teaching middle school boys, adolescent boys, and I want to help them become more open-minded, it's going to be important for me to keep in mind that just in terms of their brain development at that age, their ability to take up alternative perspectives is limited. Another example might be if I'm serving students who are marginalized or have come from a background where they've been subject to considerable racial injustice. In contexts like this, it might be important for me to favor virtues like intellectual autonomy or courage over virtues like intellectual humility. Whereas if I'm dealing with a more privileged student population, intellectual humility might top my list of virtues that I'm hoping that my students will make some progress in. So again, when it comes to selecting virtues that we're interested in, or how exactly we conceptualize those, or what we expect of our students in relation to these virtues, very important to keep in mind who our students are and allow those decisions to be informed and shaped by their various identities. Okay, so the first of two practices itself involves creating opportunities for students to practice intellectual virtues. So the idea is that one of the primary things that we can do as teachers in a classroom to help our students make progress in these qualities is to create frequent, well-supported, well-designed opportunities for them to practice our target virtues. And in the background here is the idea that each intellectual virtue has a characteristic skill or competence. Open-mindedness, for instance, has to do with the competence of switching perspectives. Intellectual autonomy has to do with or involves the competence of thinking for oneself. Intellectual humility involves the competence of identifying and being willing to accept or own one's intellectual limitations and mistakes. So the idea is that to help my students develop a particular virtue, I need to create opportunities for them to practice that competence. And I think here, as maybe some of you do as well, about Aristotle's remark in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, to the effect that we become builders by building, lyre players by playing the lyre. So too we become just, I would say, open-minded, intellectually humble, intellectually autonomous, by doing just actions, temperate by doing temperate actions, courageous by courageous actions. So virtues have a skill dimension, and the way we develop skills or competencies is through practice. Now, what might this look like? Well, here are a few kind of basic steps. If you're setting out to do this for the first time, you'll want to start by identifying a subset of target virtues. Then you'd want to be clear about how you're conceptualizing their characteristic expressions or competencies or skills. And then you'd proceed to think about incorporating frequent opportunities for them to practice those skills or competencies into in-class exercises, assignments, papers, assessments, projects, and so on. And it's critical when we do this that we ensure that our students have the support and the scaffolding that they need in order to engage in this practice well. So I need to help them understand what it is to perspective switch or to perspective switch well, if open-mindedness is one of the virtues I'm going to have them practice, and so on. So scaffolding and support, and also providing them with appropriate feedback that they can use to then improve their practice over time is critical. As with so much of educating for intellectual virtues, I suspect that this is something that many of you already do. So there are lots of informal ways in which many of us create regular opportunities for our students to practice various virtues. For instance, when we insist that they explain a certain concept or idea or subject matter and not merely regurgitate what they've read in a book or seen on a PowerPoint slide. There, we're asking them, inviting them, encouraging them to practice virtues like thoroughness and carefulness and tenacity. Similarly, we often have students consider potential objections to something they believe or alternative perspectives on some issue. And when we do that, we are inviting them to practice virtues like humility and open-mindedness. Similarly, we often ask students to formulate or defend a thesis or to make a conjecture. And when they do that and do it well, they're practicing the competencies or skills characteristic of virtues like intellectual autonomy or intellectual courage. Finally, we sometimes, for many of us, myself included, not enough, but we certainly can create frequent opportunities for our students to just sit back and wonder. I don't mean just, does anybody have any questions? I mean to sit back and wonder and to invite them to consider, what does this make you think about? What does this make you wonder? And when what are you puzzling about? When we give them opportunities to wrestle with questions and to wonder, we're giving them an opportunity to practice curiosity. And the more opportunities we can provide for them to practice virtues like this, the more they will develop the competence specific to the virtues in question. I'm only going to mention very briefly another slightly more formal way to give students opportunities to practice intellectual virtues, and this is thinking routines. This idea has come out of the Project Zero research that I mentioned previously. If you just Google thinking routines Project Zero, you can find your way to lots of really helpful online sources. But thinking routines are just basic thinking protocols that involve just a few steps. They can be used across subject matters. They are easy to implement and to scaffold, and they create opportunities for students or teachers to practice the virtues of good thinking. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but one of these is claim, support, question, whereas the name suggests the students are asked to make a claim, to support that claim, and then to raise a question that someone might have about their argument. That's a structured way that to provide them with opportunities to practice virtues like autonomy, thoroughness, and curiosity. I'll go down to circle of viewpoints. which involves looking at a particular event, it might be, or it might be a work of art, or it could be a proposed piece of legislation. And then as a group, you go through and try to identify as many different possible perspectives on this object or issue as you can. And then students are invited to step into each of these perspectives and think about the object or the topic from these different perspectives. And this is an opportunity to practice virtues like humility and open-mindedness, among many others as well. Curiosity would be one that would be relevant there too. So if you want to learn more about thinking routines, there are lots of excellent resources out there. I'll just let you, we're not going to have time to go through this. This is just sort of an exercise that I might invite you to do if we had more time. So you can take a picture of this or a screenshot if you want to. It just provides a list of the different virtues that I mentioned before. And then I'd encourage you to step back and ask yourself, what are 2 or 3 virtues on the list that you'd most like to nurture in your students? And then what are some ways that you already provide them with opportunities to practice those virtues? You might think about how the kind of support that you provide and the scaffolding and the feedback that you provide on those opportunities. And then you might consider, what are some ways that I can build on those practices? What are other ways that I can give my students opportunities to exercise your target virtues? And how else might you support them and provide feedback and so on? The second practice that I want to discuss is the importance of modeling intellectual virtues for our students. So we can give them opportunities to practice these virtues, but it's also unsurprisingly important for us to model the virtues themselves and to practice what we preach. James Baldwin has a nice remark about this. He says, children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. They have no other models. To drill down on the importance of modeling just a little bit, I think modeling intellectual virtues has a twofold effect. First of all, it provides students with a concrete representation of what these virtues look like in practice. I can introduce my students to the idea of open-mindedness or intellectual humility or intellectual courage. I can give them definitions of these virtues. But if I put them into practice by modeling them for my students and modeling them authentically, I provide my students with a more tangible and concrete expression of what these virtues look like in practice. Secondly, in most cases, I think, these examples will be motivating for students. These are attractive qualities. We like to see in ourselves and the people we care about and spend time with qualities like curiosity and intellectual autonomy and carefulness and thoroughness and intellectual courage and open-mindedness. These are attractive qualities, and so seeing them in action can be motivating. It can be inspiring. So by modeling intellectual virtues for our students, we can help elicit from them a motivation to practice these virtues. Dewey has a nice remark here. He says, everything the teacher does, as well as the manner in which he does it, incites the child to respond in some way or another, and each response tends to set the child's attitude in some way or other. What might this look like? Well, here again, I want to suggest that most of you probably do this already to a greater or lesser extent. But one of the things we can do is allow our students to see or really hear us think out loud, to share our thinking with our students. Sometimes we get into a mode of communicating ideas and information, sort of the delivery of content. But if that's all we do, then we may not be kind of giving students a window onto how we actually think. So we can allow our students to learn how we think. I know in my own case, I learned a lot about how to do philosophy just by listening to how my professors thought out loud. So we can think out loud for our students, and in doing so, model a wide range of virtues for them. Another similar thing we can do is to wonder out loud. Again, if we're simply always conveying information and not stepping back and thinking about it or wondering about it, then we're missing an opportunity to model, in the latter case, virtues like curiosity or open-mindedness. And especially when we can do this kind of wondering spontaneously, or this kind of thinking spontaneously and authentically, I think it can be especially moving for students. Finally, we can take risks, and we can be willing to, rather than steering away from our limitations or ignorance being exposed as we're teaching, we can sometimes take the risk of moving toward some of our limitations, or volunteering things that we don't really know or understand or have struggled with or do struggle with in a learning context. That can be a way of modeling for our students virtues like courage and humility. And I have a nice example of the power that this kind of modeling can have. The example that I'll share is a quote from Father Robert Lawton, who is a former president of Loyola Marymount University, where I teach. So he shared with me the story about showing up to Harvard for graduate school, and was in one of his first graduate seminars that was taught by a world-renowned scholar. And one of his fellow students asked the professor a question, to which the professor stopped, paused, and responded by saying, "I don't know. I need to think more about your question. I'll get back to you about it." But he admitted that he didn't know the answer to the student's question. And here's his account of the effect that that experience had on him. So this was just in personal correspondence a few years ago. He said, "It was the first time that I could remember a teacher saying, 'I don't know.' And this man was one of the leading scholars in the world. From then on, I began to feel that it was all right not to know." And pay attention to the progression here. I no longer had to pretend to know. From then on, I began to think things through. I wanted to know not what someone else thought, but what I thought. I realized it was okay to be wrong for a time while searching for the truth. Of course, this was just the beginning of the journey, but it had begun. The fact that I still vividly remember these moments some 50 years later shows how powerful these moments were. So this is one instance of modeling intellectual humility that had a transformative impact on this person. Not only did it make it safe for Father Lawton to practice intellectual humility, it also inspired him to practice other virtues. He said, as a consequence of this experience, he found himself wanting to think things through, maybe a kind of intellectual thoroughness, and that he wanted to know not just what someone else thought, but what he thought, which suggests a kind of intellectual autonomy. So this is a beautiful example that I think a lot of us can relate to from our own experience as students. It's an example of how authentic modeling from the expert in the room can have an impact on the development and formation of our students. So a quick kind of checklist for you to consider as you think about some of your own pedagogical principles, the guiding principles, the principles that guide your practice, and the practices themselves. So do I have concrete and realistic characterological goals for my students? Do I create a safe, supportive, and respectful classroom environment? Is my thinking informed and guided by the specific identities of my students? Do I provide them with frequent and well-supported opportunities to practice intellectual virtues, And do I consistently and authentically model these virtues? I will close then with a selection from Plato's Republic, in particular from his famous allegory of the cave. And I'll not try to explain the entire allegory. Hopefully most of you are familiar with it, but you have a group of prisoners who have spent their entire lives chained up and facing the back wall of a cave, and behind them is the entrance to the cave. And because this is reality as they've known it, they believe that what is ultimately good and real and true are just the shadows on the wall of the cave. And at some point, one of the prisoners gets released and taken out of the cave and begins to see that what he thought was real, what he thought was true and good, is at best a very limited and imperfect copy or resemblance or shadow of what is truly real and good. And I think a lot of us as educators can identify with the idea of wanting to help our students see and understand and love in the way that we love the subject matter and content and skills and so on that we teach. And it's often missed that Plato's allegory it illustrates many different facets of his thought. But Plato himself suggests that it's really making a point about the nature of education. So here's what Socrates, speaking for Plato, says. He says, education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. You might think here of the so-called banking model of education, that we're just sort of depositing knowledge into our students' minds. He says, contrary to that, he says, the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and the instrument with which each person learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from that which is coming into being without turning the whole soul until it is able to study that which is and the brightest thing that is. In other words, imagine being told to look at what's immediately behind you. You can't just turn your eyes and see what is immediately behind you. Your whole body needs to be turned around. Your whole self needs to be reoriented before your eyes, which in this case is representing our ability to learn, can really see what it needs to see. So he says, education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. So the idea is that our students have wonderful, capable minds, but in some sense, we have to reorient their entire selves towards learning and knowledge and truth and evidence and maybe even wisdom if we want them to really meet their full intellectual potential. And I think this is a wonderful way to describe what it is to try to educate for intellectual virtues, because as we noted at the outset, these are qualities of persons. They say something about who we are. They comprise our overall personal orientation toward learning. And that is all I've got. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here.
All right, once you're ready, Kwado, feel free to take over.
Thank you so much. Can somebody give me a signal if you can hear me, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Baehr, for such an informative and much needed presentation. Before I respond, I would like to thank Dr. Reitzmer here at King's College, Dr. Sojaga also here at King's College, and Dr. Stami at Elmhurst University. Thank you all for your diverse contributions to this event. Thank you also to all who contributed but who I am unaware of, and thank you all for being here tonight. I begin in the same fashion that Dr. Baehr ended his presentation, and that is by making reference to a metaphor, one that I was introduced to as an undergraduate and have found simple and intriguing all at the same time, and to which Dr. Baehr makes reference to in his book, Deep Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues. This metaphor comes to us by way of the Greek philosopher Plato, and it is often referred to as the allegory of the cave. Dr. Baehr employs this metaphor to brilliantly illustrate the importance of teaching for intellectual virtues in education. Permit me to shed some light on this metaphor for the benefit of those who may be hearing of it for the first time. To quote from Deep in Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues, and I quote, Socrates asks his interlocutor, Glaucon, who is the brother of Plato, to imagine a group of prisoners who have been held captive in an underground cave for their entire lives. Bound and shackled, the prisoners are forced to face the back wall of the cave, the entrance being some distance behind them and entirely out of their sight. Immediately behind the prisoners is a walkway, and behind the walkway is a large fire. Other inhabitants of the cave carry various artifacts across the walkway, casting shadows on the wall in front of the prisoners. Because the shadows are all they've ever known, the prisoners mistake them for ultimate reality. And I quote, what does this allegory mean? What is in it for us educators? Is it contrasting belief and knowledge? Yes, it is. But before delving into interpretations, let us listen to the response given by Socrates in relation to this metaphor. Again, quoting from Dr. Baehr's book. And I quote, the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from that which is coming into being without turning the whole soul until it is able to study that which is, and the brightest thing that is, namely the one we call the good. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. And I want to quote that part again. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. Perhaps we can situate the allegory of the cave on the spectrum of moving from how things have been traditionally done in education to the intentionality of purpose that comes with teaching for intellectual virtues. Educators are the conduit through which this turning around occurs by way of their impartation of these cardinal propositions that we call intellectual virtues. In response to this metaphor, let us refer to John Dewey, one of America's foremost educators, when he postulates that, and I quote, it is the business of education to cultivate deep-seated and effective habits of discriminating tested beliefs from mere assertions, guesses, and opinions to develop a lively, sincere, and open-minded preference for conclusions that are properly grounded, and to ingrain in the individual's working habits methods of inquiry and reasoning appropriate to the various problems that present themselves. And I quote, the assertion that John Dewey makes is for a deep and passionate search for truths. As educators, we may just want to teach the subjects without giving any thought to the teaching of intellectual virtues. Teaching is much more than the simple focus on the subject. We must teach the whole individual. Again, John Dewey makes a proposition to the wider goals of education and to which the teaching of intellectual virtues is important. Dewey sees education as vital to the maintenance of democracy and the teaching of intellectual virtues as an intrinsic part of any education that has any chance of sustaining democracy and its institutions. To this end, Dewey again says, and I quote, "Modern life means democracy. Democracy means freeing intelligence for independent effectiveness, the emancipation of mind as an individual organ to do its own work." The teaching of intellectual virtues develops in the individual the ability to function independently and for the common good. But what exactly are intellectual virtues? The Intellectual Virtues Academy, of which Dr. Baehr is a co-founder, defines it as, and I quote, "personal qualities of a good thinker or learner, traits like curiosity, wonder, open-mindedness, and intellectual perseverance or grit. Intellectual virtues involve the best practices of human thinking." How does the learner access these qualities? The teacher must teach them. Again, as has been suggested by Dewey, schools today lack recognition of the primacy of the principle of freedom of intelligence. This, according to him, is reflected in the undemocratic organization of the school itself, which impacts both teacher and learner in ways that do not advance the ideals of democracy in and beyond the walls of the school. So yes, teaching for intellectual values is important to the maintenance of democratic institutions, but there is something more. It is also crucial to the maintenance of the ideals of the common good. The notion of the common good is here used in reference to all those facilities provided to all members of society, be it material, cultural, or institutional, as a matter of obligation for the realization of common interest of the members of society. The purpose of education is encapsulated in the ideals expressed by Dr. Baehr in chapter 1 of his book, Deep in Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues. Intellectual virtues can only become intrinsic to the national psyche when taught. Academic, social, political, and economic ideals all work together for the common good when they are transmitted to our students within the framework of intellectual virtues. Dewey again reminds us that, and I quote, "Unless education has some frame of reference, it is bound to be useless, lacking a unified objective," end quote. In the slide presentation just given by Dr. Baehr, we have seen him present in detail the principles of teaching intellectual virtues and their implications for classroom practice. Not only are we being asked to be teachers of intellectual virtues, but ones who do so by example. We have to become living models of intellectual virtues. Let's do what Dewey tells us to do. That is, critically reflect on our reality in order to continuously move towards a more democratic society. It is not a destination, it is a journey. Ladies and gentlemen, we must avoid what James Baldwin refers to as the paradox of education. This paradox that exists in education, which begs the questions, should education develop individuals solely on the basis of furthering the aims of society, or should education develop individuals who desire to make positive change in society? Can positive change in education, and by extension the society writ large, be achieved without all members of the society having a seat at the table? After all, quoting Dewey, and I quote, "Our public school system was founded in the name of equality of opportunity for all, independent of birth, economic status, race, creed, or color," end quote. How do we ensure that the education system addresses these aims, which were articulated upon its inception? We must be intentional about teaching intellectual virtues. We must be intentional about teaching virtues to the service of creating an inclusive, democratic society that seeks schools interested in listening and responding to diverse voices in the interest of the common good. Education is a two-way street. Teachers also learn from their students. Teachers can learn virtues from their students. This is so because when teachers listen to students about their experiences and take their perspectives seriously, a truly dialogic classroom culture is created in which both teacher and student are active learners and teachers. Are there multiple dimensions to what virtues are? In other words, are virtues universal, or are they culture specific? I pose these questions because I simply cannot help it. Having been born in Ghana, West Africa, I relate to the 9 virtues presented, which are also clearly articulated through Ghanaian proverbs and symbols like Adinkra. Yet in this context, there are other expressions of intellectual virtues. Let's hear a few examples. There is expressed as an intellectual virtue the notion of intellectual readiness. Both the teacher and the learner have to possess this character trait for good learning processes to be facilitated. Closely linked are the virtues of tolerance and respect, as expressed in proverbs such as the one that says, "Apatiprel se obi nima obi tre," meaning the forest bird, Apatiprel, says, "If one does not know, someone teaches." Then there is the idea of intellectual foresight, roughly defined as one's ability to make intellectual or epistemic progress, which can occur by the individual's ability to think ahead in real time. There is also intellectual empathy that advances the idea of teaching students to understand other people's thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and in accordance with that, learning to appreciate dissenting opinions. And there are more, but I believe that the point has been made. I believe that the case can be made for consideration be given to diverse perspectives in the discussion and teaching of intellectual virtues. It would be interesting to see how its teaching will be impacted by such a consideration. Perhaps these are questions that we must all grapple with, and which Dr. Baehr may consider in his next volume. In conclusion, this presentation and book could not have come at a better time, a time that is being dominated by cultural wars in education. Education must be purposeful, and teaching for intellectual values provides us with a framework that is both purposeful and practical. Dr. Baehr's book, Deep in Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues, is timely, well laid out, and reader-friendly. Let us all make it a point to purchase one, and I guarantee your craft will not regret the decision. Thank you all so much for having me, and have a wonderful evening. This brings me to the end of my response.
Thank you so much, Kwado, for your response, and Jason, for your initial talk. Jason, is there a way you'd like to jump in, or I have a question to start off with otherwise, whatever you like?
I'll just say a very quick thank you, Professor, for your remarks, and I appreciate some of the deeper ties to Dewey. I appreciate the idea that this sort of educational approach is very much a two-way street, and that our own intellectual character formation is something we need to attend to just as much as that of our students. And also thank you for the application to a different cultural context. I think you illustrate there what I hope is the answer to your initial question, which is that I think this approach is likely to look somewhat similar across different contexts, but that there may be different virtues and different ways of conceptualizing certain virtues that emerge or become more salient from one cultural context to another. So thank you for that example and for the rest of your remarks.
All right, great. I have a number of questions that have been popping up, and some of them kind of cross each other, and so I'm going to try to pull them together. In some cases, a few questions into one. And the first question we're going to ask, I do think this comes from a student actually, is that the basic kind of question is this a particularly good cultural moment for IVP, for intellectual virtues pedagogy? Now, both you and Kwado talk about the allegory of the cave, and the power to learn is in the soul of each person. And that tends to suggest that IVP belongs in lots of different cultural contexts, lots of different situations. But is there something about today? Are there some cultural weaknesses we have right now that IVP especially addresses, or figure out however you want to answer that question? Is there something about today that makes intellectual virtues pedagogy especially important? And to connect this to Kwado's remarks too, part of what Kwado brings up is concern about the common good. And we might wonder, it's not how Kwado put it, but a listener kind of wonders whether Kwado is suggesting that as wondrous as intellectual virtues pedagogy is, it needs to be supplemented by other things like a pedagogy directed at the deep concerns about contemporary problems concerning the common good. So there's sort of an initial question for Jason there, and we can head it over in Kwado's direction if we like.
So 2 points. One, to part of the latter part of your remarks. I don't think that this is a cure-all within education or within society at large, and I do think it is it's getting at an important, fundamental, neglected educational aim, but it's not the only aim that matters or of exhaustive importance. But I do think it speaks to our cultural moment in a lot of ways. Let me just give one example, and this relates to the context of public discourse. And I think we're all probably pretty exasperated with and unhappy about the state of public and political discourse in our democracy here in the US. And I'll just note that one of the things that is so prevalent in this context is that of vilifying people who think differently than we do. And notice that vilification is largely a mental or intellectual or cognitive activity, and I think it's very poor as cognitive activity goes, and I think it often manifests what we can call intellectual vices. Like closed-mindedness or narrow-mindedness or intellectual dishonesty or apathy or what have you. But I don't even think we need that kind of language or those sorts of charges to understand vilification. I mean, I think that's part of what might be going on in some cases. I think there's also just fear. But in any case, it seems like our interactions with people who see the world differently than we do could be benefited significantly by a more widespread practice virtues like intellectual humility, admitting that my perspective is limited, that my evidence base is not infallible, that there's a lot I don't know. Open-mindedness, which is consistent, by the way, with firm conviction. But if I'm open-minded, I'm willing to try to think about and understand something from an alternative point of view, and to give that point of view an honest and fair hearing. And then the third virtue that comes to mind in this context would be curiosity, where even if we can't agree with our interlocutor, even if, in certain cases we might think our interlocutor's view is so reprehensible that we shouldn't even be open-minded about it. I think we're probably too quick to make those judgments, but I think sometimes those judgments are probably right. But even in those cases, we can still practice curiosity, and we can ask ourselves, I wonder how you came to see the world like that. I wonder what good you're getting from holding to the belief that you hold. So I think there are lots of opportunities to practice intellectual virtues in the context of public discourse that would be really helpful for our democracy today.
Thank you. Kwado, you, I know, have worked in a elementary school and middle school where a social justice pedagogy was employed. And again, the questioner actually wondered whether you were thinking that there's something crucial about that pedagogy that needs to be added to education. So I think the listener would like to hear you comment on that. The emphasis being on, does something need to be added? You're still muted.
I wonder if is he able to unmute, or does someone else have to? Yeah, you might be unable to
Bernard, are you able to
unmute yourself?
How about shall I ask?
I'm on it. I'm on it. 1 second.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. So thank you, Dr. Reitzmer, for that. And also I would like to thank the person who posed the question. I do see a direct link between the teaching for intellectual virtues and social justice. And this is why. I think that intellectual virtues, as I just illustrated, is education that addresses the whole person. And the addressing of this whole person is also directly tied into the kind of society that we want to live in. And as Dewey expressed, democracy as an institution has certain tenets. So when we think about social justice, we're also thinking about what kind of problems exist in our society and what can we do about it? What can we do to address those problems? And the reason why I do see the link between social justice and intellectual virtues is once students are prepared with these intellectual virtues, once students understand the importance of being intellectually courageous, then you can then take a stance to say, these are the problems that I see that exist in society, and this is what I can do about it, or this is what we can do about it as a collective. So I think that each one strengthens the other. Intellectual virtues may be used in classrooms to, as I mentioned earlier on, give the student a well-rounded, full education not just in terms of the subject matter, but also in terms of developing the individual internally. And then social justice comes and says, yeah, look, we are not a perfect society. There are things that we can rectify, and social justice also, similar to intellectual virtues, provides us with a framework with which to rectify the problems that exist in our society. So I think that is an excellent question, and I hope that I have given you some adequate form of response to that question.
Yes, thank you, Kwado. I have another question that comes, I know in this case, from a bright and energetic, very thoughtful honor students from here at King's. And he does a bit of confessing here. He admits that he has a few intellectual vices that emerge from time to time. He admits to being occasionally intellectually arrogant, but also at the same time, sometimes overly careful as a student. And more or less, he's asking Dr. Baehr, Jason, what are a few practices? I mean, introspection might make these, make him aware of these things, but what can he do to start to mitigate these vices? So he's looking for a little advice.
Remind me what was the virtue that the student, or the vice that the student felt like
he's occasionally prone to arrogance. Arrogance.
Well, here's the good news. The fact that he was willing to admit that in a public forum like this suggests that he also has a fair degree of intellectual humility and a little bit of intellectual courage. And actually, I think both of those are virtues that are relevant to addressing the second thing he mentioned, which was a kind of excess of intellectual carefulness. One of the things I didn't talk about in my talk was that I think, in keeping with Aristotle's so-called doctrine of the mean, I think that every intellectual virtue as well, Aristotle's talking about ethical virtues, but I think intellectual virtues are a mean or midpoint between two extremes, one being a vice of deficiency, one being a vice of excess. So typically when we think about failures of carefulness, we might think about carelessness. But you can also go too far with carefulness. And any of us who struggle sometimes with perfectionist tendencies probably skew in the direction of an excess of carefulness. And I can't offer individualized counsel in this context, but I can say for myself that insofar as I'm often prone to an excess of carefulness, I think it often betrays in me a kind of discomfort with intellectual limitations and a kind of fear of failure. And so if I can think about ways of trying to become more accepting of my intellectual limitations, and also see the value of being willing to take risks, even the risks of being wrong or making a mistake. In other words, if it may be this kind of, just as far as an answer to the question, this may move me from the frying pan into the fire, but I think what we could say is that one way to try to bring your carefulness back into the mean position would be through trying to practice and do other things to arrange your circumstances to help elicit virtues like humility and courage. Greater intellectual humility and greater intellectual courage can help, again, bring carefulness back into the center, away from a kind of excessive state, I think. That's an initial pass, at least, at the answer.
Thank you. I think maybe we're starting to wind down. Maybe there'll be two questions in a moment, and I want to make a quick plug before those questions come in. For those of you listening, at King's, we also have a journal house here called Zeal, the Journal for the Liberal Arts. And there's going to be a forum published probably in early October on Jason Baehr's book. And many of the contributors for that forum are actually in attendance today. Kwado is going to be contributing. And so people are going to be commenting on Jason's book, and he'll have a chance to respond in that forum. So keep your eye open for that forum, especially if you're excited by the ideas that are popping out today. So the two questions, and we have maybe just a little bit of time to answer them. One is a question: have these methods, the intellectual virtue pedagogy methods, been tested in particular for students in dysfunctional family situations or other really rough social conditions? That's one question. A very different question, I suppose, is the question from another listener. Is there any way to assess? Is there any kind of assessment methods that actually a school system could use to see how well they're doing in terms of these these kind of pedagogies. That's I don't know that that's from a nervous administrator, but sometimes those are questions nervous school administrators ask. So 2 questions again. Have these been tested in dysfunctional family environments? Are these accessible traits?
Mhm. Wow. Okay. How much time do we have?
Yeah, well, it's fair to be, brief if you can.
I'll do my best. I mean, I have a whole unwritten and probably never will be written book length response to maybe each question, but at least to the questions combined. So let as far as assessment goes, we'll take the questions in reverse order. As far as assessment goes, how it might be done depends on how ambitious you want to be, the kind of information you want to get, and what your purpose is in trying to gather that information, and how scientific you want to be about it. But let me just say something. Like, if I think of these virtues as having different dimensions, one of those dimensions is a skill dimension. And I've talked about that in the talk, that every virtue involves a kind of skill, and you can't have the virtue unless you have the skill. Well, some of these skills are I don't want to say easy, but they're not so difficult to measure, either scientifically or unscientifically, like as a teacher might do in an ordinary classroom environment. So if I want to, let's say I want to help my students make some progress in curiosity and open-mindedness, okay, then I can create assignments and exercises that invite them to, encourage them to, and provide the necessary support to practice those virtues. And if that expectation is built into the assignment itself, then when I go to assess the student's performance on the assignment, I'll also be assessing how well they practiced perspective switching in the case of open-mindedness. Or let's say I want them to create like a reverse quiz where I want them to come up with questions, not answers to questions. That's an opportunity for them to practice curiosity. And so there are normal, familiar ways that we can ask students to practice these virtues, and it's not mysterious how we would assess those practices. Now, a student doing well on either of the kind of assignments that I just mentioned doesn't necessarily show that they've mastered the skills appropriate to virtues, nor does it say anything about their development along other dimensions of the virtue, like the motivational dimension, say. So virtues are complex. I think we have to measure them from different angles or along different dimensions. We can do that more or less scientifically. The whole construct of intellectual virtue is relatively new within empirical and social sciences, but there are validated measures for several intellectual virtues that could be used if you wanted to adopt a more kind of scientific approach. And then to the first question about whether research has been done pertaining to students, growth in these qualities who come from dysfunctional backgrounds, I'm not sure about that specific kind of background or group of students, but research has been done, for instance, at both of there's an intellectual virtues middle school, and then subsequent to that, there was an intellectual virtues high school was also created. And we've had expert researchers come into these contexts that serve quite a diverse student population that's representative of the city of Long Beach in California, which is an extremely diverse city. And there is some empirical evidence suggesting that some of the practices and interventions that have been employed by teachers in this context have led to statistically significant growth for students at these schools, compared with the control group schools. So these studies, one recently done by Mary Helen Imordino Yang at USC, do indicate that this is something that that students, even who have experienced trauma and other challenging background circumstances, can benefit from. And then certainly at both of these schools, there's an overwhelming amount of anecdotal evidence, and the high school in particular serves a very, very underserved student population, and the relative progress they've seen with their students academically and social emotionally, and in terms of intellectual character development, has been pretty remarkable.
I think that's a pretty rich answer in all of about 4 or 5 minutes. So thank you. We're probably just going to have to call it a night tonight, though. It's been great. There's obviously lots more questions that could be asked, and I apologize to anyone whose questions I didn't get to. But one last kind of thank you to Jason. One last kind of thank you to Kwado for your remarks. And again, this conversation is going to be continuing in print even in the coming half year. So keep an eye open for that. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Professor Oppong-Wadie. Many thanks for your comments. And